Hi, welcome to Hollywood Crime Scene. This is Rachel Fisher.
Hi, this is Desi Jedeikin.
How's it going, Des?
Good. I have a piece of popcorn stuck in my throat. I'm very professional.
We put a big bowl of caramel corn on an improvised side table, which is just we have a seat. We have a seat at this table right now for our caramel corn.
The seat of Elijah.
It's for Elijah. Elijah liked caramel corn. Little known fact. I also want to thank we didn't thank Tony last week. I don't think. He just became a Patreon contributor.
Right. Check out our Patreon for hilarious bonus episodes.
We have
ourselves, and there's like a huge backlog now.
Right.
So for $5, you're going to get a ton of stuff.
A ton of stuff. And most of it's very dirty and inappropriate. And tonight, our Patreon episode that we're recording is extra spooky and Halloween themed. So you're definitely going to want to check that one out. That's patreon.com/Hollywood Crime Scene.
Speaking of Halloween, kind of what inspired tonight's episode is I was sort of looking around to see if any kind of crazy crime happened around Halloween time, because I figured there had to be something.
Right.
And there actually was something, and it's a crime that I actually followed for a very long time. So this week, it's actually going to be a 2-part episode. So tonight is part 1 because there's a lot of information here. So we're coming up on the 42-year anniversary. Is that correct? Hold on a second. Let me do my math. 35.
Desi's the scientist on this show, not the mathematician.
Yeah. Anyways, I could be wrong. It's the really long anniversary. Can we start over?
No.
Okay. The murder of Martha Moxley, which is not a laughing matter. I first learned about this murder from my longtime old man crush, Dominick Dunne, who I have loved since I was a child.
Who you may remember as the father of one of the subjects in episode 3, the poltergeist curse.
Right. And he's also a pretty big true crime writer, he's dead now, but of natural causes. Anyways, he wrote a book called A Season in Purgatory, which I read, and I also saw the miniseries that was based on the novel. And then at some point I found out that book was based on a true crime. So once I realized it was based on a real crime, I really sort of started looking into that. And I started following his writing on the case in Vanity Fair, which he had I think it was a pretty regular column for Vanity Fair that was sort of like crime and rich, sort of the rich and famous. So it was actually Dominick Dunne's writing on the case in Vanity Fair that kind of brought the case at that point, which I think it started in the early 90s was when the book was written, had been a cold case for almost 20 years at that point. So anyways, let's get into it. I'm going to start it off. Do you remember the old show City Confidential?
No.
Okay. It was an old A&E show that was about crime, and every week was a different city. And it was narrated by this actor, Paul Winfield, who had this really deep voice. He would narrative, and it was always like a crime. It was always sort of it was a slow and easy kind of town. Every episode started off with a little bio of the town, and I would always be very invested. It's ooh, Tupelo, Mississippi, and it was just you'd have images B-roll of people riding bikes on the street, and da-da-da-da. And it was it always got you really in, and then it would be a crime that happened in this slow and sleepy town. So City Confidential style, let's go back to 1975, Greenwich, Connecticut, which is a very exclusive community. Really, really, when you think of
Waspy.
If you think of waspy, New England, rich, wealthy types, this is where they all live.
Zero.
This is ground zero of rich bitches. Big mansions, fucking grounds with landscaping and what are those things called?
Ralph
Topiary.
Lauren.
Yeah, it's Ralph Lauren, yachts, country clubs, the whole works. So on the evening of October 30th, 1975, a young girl who I believe was 15 years old at the time named Martha Moxley was out with her friends attending something called Mischief Night, which was sort of the night before Halloween.
Halloween Eve.
Yeah, Halloween Eve. Basically doing things I don't know if you did this stuff as as a kid when you were celebrating Halloween, like shaving cream fights and toilet paper.
Yeah, it seems like
Like that kind of stuff where you're not
Halloween
like trick-or-treating anymore, but you're out creating.
You're egging houses.
You know, I'm sure. And like whatever the rich kid version of that is, throwing
Hurling.
Fabergé eggs houses. I have no idea.
Right.
So anyways, toilet papering, just fucking around. And rich kids we all know that they're even worse than us. Like, but Martha was probably very nice. So according to people who were around that night, Moxley began flirting and fooling around to varying degrees, according to different sources, with a guy named Thomas Skakel, who was 17. Moxley was last seen, and it was described as falling together behind a fence with Thomas Skakel near the pool in his backyard at around 9:30 p.m. One thing you have to understand about this location, and I looked at like a map of it because I was sort of unclear when I was reading all the information. All of these houses are huge.
Right.
And they're all sort of like connected to each other. Like if you have an overhead view, they're all next to each other, but mansion next to each other.
Right.
So they're kind of far apart, but they're all sort of connected in a way. Like there's no like fences and I don't know.
Neighbors.
Yeah, you know the neighbors. You're sort of all on top of each other, but still very far apart because these are huge mansions. So Martha was supposed to be home by 10 p.m. that night, and when she didn't get home by 12, her mom, Dorothy, and friends and family began searching for her. The next day, Halloween, Moxley's body was actually found underneath a tree in her family's backyard. That's how big these areas are, because she was actually in the yard when people were searching for her the night before. So she was actually found by a classmate, another 15-year-old classmate, under this pine tree in her own backyard. Her body appeared to have been dragged 60 or 80 feet. I guess they had some kind of markings that showed that. The only other thing at the crime scene was a number 6 Tony Penna, I don't know if I'm saying that correctly, golf club, which later was proven to have been taken from a set from the Skakel's home, which is, you know, as I said, sort of next door,
nearby,
but sort of far. Martha had been struck so hard that the shaft of the golf club was broken into 4 pieces.
Oh my God.
Only 3 of the pieces were at the scene, actually. The grip part, which is probably where the fingerprints were, was nowhere to be found. The killer, at some point, after he broke the golf club on her, took one of the jagged pieces and stabbed her through the neck. So obviously in a town like Greenwich, Connecticut, this is
shocking.
not something that happens all the time. So this murder was pretty shocking, and it's a pretty gruesome murder. I mean, she was beat like pretty
hard.
Badly.
And she was probably still alive when she was stabbed through the neck.
Right. And it was bloody, a bloody scene.
Right.
So there, you know, obviously, as we know about these kind of towns, there's also like a lot of gossiping and da-da-da-da. So there was sort of like the initial gossiping, like, oh, some awful hitchhiker or transient came in and stole a golf club from someone's house and beat the shit out of this poor girl. Okay. But this also being that type of gossipy environment, a lot of people, the exact neighborhood in Greenwich is called Bellhaven. That's how it's like even more exclusive than Greenwich.
Right.
They thought that it was pretty likely that it could have also been one of the brothers who lived in the residence of Rushton Skakel, who was a widower with 6 sons and a daughter. And he basically was raising these kids. His wife had died a few years earlier. So he's alone, a very wealthy man in this home with 7 children and a staff, basically. Now, Skakel, Rushton Skakel, is the brother of Ethel Skakel, who was the widow of Senator Robert F. Kennedy. So that's his connection to the Kennedy family. His sister married a Kennedy, basically. But the Skakels were also very, very wealthy. They, at some point, had owned one of the largest privately held companies in the world that I think was like a carbon company. Some people say the Skakels were even richer than the Kennedys. And the sort of patriarchs of the family, George Skakel and Joe Kennedy, had sort of a rivalry. Skakel referred to Joe Kennedy as low-life Irish trash, which I love. I love rich people fights. And then I think they just didn't have a good relationship. But they were also, another thing they had in common was that the Skakels also had a lot of tragedy. Ethel and Rushton's parents were both killed in a private plane crash. Their brother George was also killed in a plane crash, and George's wife at some point choked to death on a piece of meat at a dinner party, which is like the mama Cass of like rich people deaths, right? And then, as I said before, Rushton's wife, Anne, who was the mother of his 7 children, died like a really horrible death from cancer in 1973, and leaving him alone with 7 children. It was actually one of Anne Skakel's golf clubs that was the weapon that was used to kill Martha Moxley. So they still had a set of her old golf clubs. Okay, so the guy I mentioned before, the boy that Martha was hanging out with, Thomas Skakel, since he was the last person known to have been seen with her the night of the murder, and he basically had zero alibi, became the prime suspect. He took several inconclusive polygraphs, and then his father kind of went back and forth, initially agreeing to release some of his school and mental health records, but then reneging on that and refusing to release them. At the time, there was also another suspect, Kenneth Littleton, who was a live-in tutor for the Skakel family, who had only just started, like, I believe it might have even been that day of Martha's murder.
Wow.
He also became a suspect. And I think he also took some polygraphs that were sort of all over the map as far as results went. And then eventually, though, no one was charged. And as I said before, the case kind of went cold. A lot of people speculated that it was Rushton Skakel's money that kind of squashed anything from happening in that case. There was other theory that like Rushton was sort of like in Greenwich, like a major force in Greenwich, whereas the Moxleys had only moved there the previous year. So there was kind of some of this like hierarchy, but sort of more like, like loyalty, like to the people. Right. You know what I mean? It was like the outsiders, like we're going to all circle in and protect our own kind of deal. So anyways, in 1991, so this is now 16 years later.
I'm sorry, the murder was
1975.
Okay.
So I don't know if you remember this at all. You were probably a little young, but you might have heard of it afterwards. William Kennedy Smith, another Kennedy family member, was tried for rape in 1991 in Palm Beach. Mm-hmm. That incident actually happened on Good Friday on March 29th, 1991, and Kennedy was 30 years old. He was in a Palm Beach bar that was actually called O-Bar. A-U. O-Bar. Ooh la la. And he was out partying with Ted Kennedy and his cousin Patrick Kennedy when they met a woman named Patricia Bowman at the bar. I guess they went back to a Kennedy family compound, and then at some point Patricia and Smith went onto the beach and took a walk, and that's where she alleged that Smith raped her. Of course, according to Smith, it was consensual, right? Of course. So obviously, being a Kennedy, he was acquitted of all charges of raping the woman. And then there was a civil action at some point that I think he settled, and then he actually settled another case of a sexual harassment a few years after that, or in 2005, actually. So it's like, I mean, once again, people are just kind of serial sexual harassers, abusers. Anyways, the point of bringing that up, he's related to the Kennedys because he is the son of Jean Kennedy Smith, who is the youngest daughter of Joseph Kennedy. And so
there's so many Kennedys.
There's a lot of Kennedys. That's why I'm always trying to clarify where they're connected.
Right. And I always get their names and their ages and sort of where they fit in mixed up.
Well, especially when they have a different last name because of marriage.
Like Maria Shriver.
Right.
I need a family tree. That's what I need to see, a family tree.
Well, Maria Shriver would be equivalent to William Kennedy Smith.
Okay.
Because they're both the children of a Kennedy daughter. So they have a different last name, but their uncle is John Kennedy and Robert Kennedy.
Right.
Whereas the Skakels are purely marriage. Like their sister married a Kennedy.
Okay.
Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Okay.
Oof, it's a lot.
So during that trial, there's a reason I'm bringing it up. A rumor started circulating that Smith was actually present the night of Moxley's murder.
Wow.
Okay. So at this time, writer Dominick Dunne was covering the William Kennedy Smith trial, and that might be where I read it. I don't remember. I mean, I do remember it happening. So obviously, he heard this rumor kind of going around. He was covering the trial. The rumor turned out to be bogus. He had not been in the Skakel house that night, but it kind of aroused Dunne's curiosity in the case once more. He had known about it a long time ago because he's actually from Connecticut.
Yeah.
He's from that area. So he started kind of poking around. He asked people what happened to the case. And everywhere he went, everyone was saying nothing happened. And so this is 16 years after, and he was sort of baffled. Like, how does this case just die out? Like, it was a big case, and it kind of involves the Kennedy family.
And it's so crazy, too.
Yeah.
It's so gruesome.
I mean, it's a young girl. Like, who's against finding out the killer of a young girl? Anyways, so he kind of started inquiring about the Moxleys. Mm-hmm. And as we said, like you mentioned before, he is the father of a murdered daughter. So he has like an extra sort of interest in like, he would obviously think like, well, what about the family? Like, where is the family? So he found out the father had died. The mother and father after her murder actually just kind of started spending more and more time in New York because they couldn't be there anymore because like I said before, everything's really close and they're in this insulated community.
They probably didn't feel like they had a lot of support.
Yeah, murdered their daughter and no one was helping them. So they kind of moved to New York. And then after the father died, the mother, Dorothy Moxley, moved to Annapolis, Maryland. So as I said before, Dominick felt kind of drawn to her. And he actually wrote her asking if he could talk to her about her daughter's murder.
Wow.
She agreed to meet him, and they met for coffee in a Baltimore, Washington airport. So he asked her, some of the things he asked her was why she had moved from Greenwich, since her leaving actually made it easier for the case to kind of die down. She wasn't there. I mean, it's a lot of the burden is on the families in these cases to really keep the memory alive, because cops are just going to move on to the next thing. And if no one's fucking up their ass about it, they'll just drop it, especially if they're getting pressure from like the richest family.
Rich family.
So she reportedly said that she just couldn't bear anymore to look out her window and see the Skakel house right there. And she called it the House of Secrets. She said she was unsure who killed her daughter, but that she's pretty certain that someone in that house knew who did it, or someone from that house did it themselves.
I mean, come on, it was one of their golf clubs.
Right. I mean, there's always a slim margin. There's like someone robbing houses and took whatever, like, it is a possibility.
It's a possibility, but she was all, but I mean, if I'm the parent in that situation and I know my daughter had been out with the Skakel boy and one of the golf clubs was used, I feel like there has to be some kind of connection there.
Another interesting thing she brought up was that the day after the murder, she saw limousines with out-of-state license plates all parked up and down the Skakel driveway.
Really?
Which is like suspicious, right?
Yeah.
So I mentioned already she moved to New York and then to Annapolis. At some point during this meeting, Dunne mentioned that he was a writer. He had written 3 books previous to this, I think. And he approached her with the idea of writing a fictionalized account of the murders. He told her that he had the hopes that if he wrote something, it might pique the interest in the case again, and that it could lead to more information about maybe what happened that night.
Kind of like Serial.
It had been so long that maybe people would start coming out of the woodwork and we'd start getting some more evidence. Because at this point, there's really no evidence or testimony.
No.
They interviewed over 500 people during the initial investigation, and nothing was said or turned up.
And at the time, they didn't have DNA testing either.
Here's like another crazy fact that I didn't know. You mentioned Dominick Dunne. Here was like the sort of final sell he gave her. He told her about his daughter. They had actually been born a year apart and were viciously attacked by a man she knew on October 30th. Dominique was also attacked on October 30th.
Right.
So both of these women were attacked by maybe people, I mean, Dominique, yes, but we're not sure with Martha yet, by someone they knew on October 30th, which I thought was fucking insane.
That is weird. By a romantic
in different
partner.
years, but like still pretty crazy coincidence. And at that point, they kind of bonded. She agreed to support the book. I don't think she even had to agree to it, but he wanted to have her support. And they actually became very close friends. So in 1993, Dunne published the book I mentioned earlier, Season in Purgatory, which was a fictional version pretty close to what happened in the Martha Moxley case. In the novel, did you ever read this book?
I didn't,
no?
but I kind of want to now.
It's good. So the novel has like the protagonist of the novel is named Harrison Burns, and he kind of is someone who receives kind of taken under the wing of the person who would be based on Skakel, the rich patriarch of a large wealthy family, and he's sort of a lower class person who's taken into this family. So he feels a little indebted to them. A very similar murder happens. A teenager named Winifred Utley is bludgeoned to death with a baseball bat in the book. And her murder was unsolved, but he believes that it's actually the son of one of his sort of his guardian or whatever. So he kind of, and the son at this point in the book, he's being groomed to be president of the United States. So it's like this sort of dilemma where he's like, do I take down the family who gave me my education and everything I have to do the right thing? That's sort of the gist of it. I think I said a miniseries was also made of the movie shortly after, and Patrick Dempsey plays the Harrison Burns character, the protagonist, and Brian Dennehy is the patriarch. Sherilyn Fenn is also in it. And of course, Edward Herrmann is in it, and he has to be in every movie that's set in the upper crusty rich world of New England. It's the Hollywood law. It's the law. So I mentioned before, like he did change some things to avoid being sued for libel. In the book, the golf club became a baseball bat. And then he changed the kind of makeup of the family.
And the names and stuff.
Yeah,
obviously.
all of that stuff, obviously. So that came out in 1993. It was like a huge bestseller, and it was immediately picked up. The story got picked up again. Like, even though he changed things, everyone knew what he was talking about. So the CBS Evening News did a long segment on the book, and it just kind of boomed the case up again. Like, it just was getting a lot of attention. And Dominic was on the TV talking a ton about the murder also. I mean, he was really invested in getting this case back on track.
Yeah.
Okay. So as much attention as things were getting, or the case was getting, still people weren't coming forward yet. It wasn't like all of a sudden like the dams broke and da-da-da-da. So during the book tour, I think it might have been in Denver, a woman approached Dunne, and she was a forensic psychologist who had worked on the initial investigation with the Greenwich police. She told him that at some point she was let go with no explanation, and she asked to meet Dunne privately after the book signing, and he agreed, of course. When they met, she handed over to him Martha's autopsy photos, which no one other than the police had seen at that point. Like, they had never been published, and it's not the internet days, right?
Right.
And here's what Dunne had to say about the autopsy photos. One of the blows this is a direct quote, one of the blows had taken off a portion of the right side of Martha's scalp, which was hanging by a piece of skin down over her face. You could see the wound where a short pointed piece of shaft had been stabbed into the side of her neck. In one full shot, you could see that her jeans had been pulled down. He said that when he saw the photos, he felt faint afterwards. And he had said to the woman that the person who did this had to have been drunk or stoned to brutalize somebody that way. He actually stopped her from showing him more. And of course, she asked not to be revealed and all of this stuff. And then as she was leaving the meeting, she whispered to him, or she said to him as she left, "It wasn't Tommy." And she repeated that it wasn't Tommy.
And Tommy was the boy.
Tommy was the boy, the 17-year-old
Right.
boy. And that's all she said. And according to Dunne, the words haunted him because he had been on TV up to that point, basically saying that Tommy had done this and really saying that it was him and pointing to evidence that really proved that there was a cover up and something was happening. And it wasn't that big of a stretch because that was pretty much what everyone was saying at that point. So after that, he went back to Connecticut, and he actually was visited by the police, the Greenwich police team that was involved in the Moxley case.
Yeah,
because he's out there and pretty much bad mouthing
this whole family.
Mm-hmm. Well, not only the family, but the police department, like
there's
and their work, the
corruption.
shoddy work. Yeah. One of the major case, or maybe like the lead detective, was named Frank Garr. He actually came to the house also. This is something I thought was really weird. They bought him kind of all this Connecticut Division of Criminal Justice swag.
Wait.
Like they got him like a coffee mug and a T-shirt. Like they brought all of this kind of stuff.
They brought that to Dunne?
Yeah, to Dunne when they met up with him. Like here's a basket of like it's like the Oscars or something.
Right, like a swag bag.
Yeah, here you go. Like here's a bobblehead and like what the hell?
Here's a poster and a calendar.
Right. So, and they basically asked him to stop criticizing the police and the police work on the case. And he kind of agreed to do that. They said it wasn't helping their ongoing investigation and all this kind of stuff. And then he mentioned to them that he saw the autopsy photos. I don't know how that happened, probably because he's a loudmouth, like gossipy. Mm-hmm. And they were like completely shocked by this news. And they said that she stole those pictures, basically accusing her of stealing them, which is probably true, right? I mean, why would she have them? Mm-hmm. So he still feels like there's some kind of mystery going on behind her story, but he kind of left it at that. So I mentioned before that the miniseries was made, and that actually came out in May 1996. It was actually an Aaron Spelling production. Ooh. I mean, so it is kind of a juicy kind of soap opera-y deal. And that also kind of gave the case another big buzz, right?
Of course.
Newspaper stories, more TV appearances. And people were just discussing the case regularly. It was like the open secret that this was about the Skakel and the Moxley murder. Okay, so 7 months after the miniseries aired, Dunne gets a call, or someone calls for Dunne at the offices of Vanity Fair magazine looking to speak to them. I mean, obviously they probably get a ton of calls like that with tips and da-da-da. For some reason, the woman who answered the phones there that day was like, this is legit. Yeah. She put him in contact with Dunne. She called Dunne and she said, I think this is about the Moxley case and I think that you have to talk to this guy. So Dunne agreed. I feel like he'll just go to any meeting, right?
Of course.
Point. So he shows up at this restaurant. I mean, it's like a fancy New York restaurant at the time. You know, Dunne is like pretty up in the upper echelon. Like you always kind of forget that he's really hoity-toity himself,
yes,
even though he's kind of from a blue-collar-ish background. So he shows up and a 24-year-old guy is there who looks even younger according to Dunne. He had just got out of university and he was a writer, but he had taken a job working at this firm. And so here's the story that he told Dunne at this restaurant that day. In 1991, so this is before Season of Purgatory, like around the time of the William Kennedy Smith trial, Rushton Skakel, at that point, he was kind of wanted to sort of exonerate his sons. He hired a private investigation firm called Sutton Associates to do a sort of secret investigation of the Martha Moxley murder. So not connected to any legal. It was like for his own thing, a private thing where they would do their own investigation and only he would know the results.
Yeah.
Everyone involved in that organization or the detectives doing the secret investigation all signed confidentiality agreements. So these are all like former detectives and police officers. So these are people who know what they're doing. They're just not like no longer officially law enforcement. He gave them complete access to all 7 of his children, and all of the records that he kept from the police were completely available to them. So he basically gave them everything he never gave to the police, right?
Wow.
So they have like full, carte blanche.
thing.
Yeah. So during their investigation, Michael Skakel, who had never been a suspect, he's the younger son of Rushton. So Thomas at the time was 17. Michael is his younger brother, who was 15 at the time of Martha's murder. He had never been a suspect because he had an alibi that he was at a cousin's house watching a Monty Python movie. But his story started changing during this private investigation. He told detectives that he had actually climbed a tree the night of the murder outside of Martha's bedroom window and jerked off in the tree.
Oh.
I know, it's not insane.
What the fuck?
Right.
I gotta climb.
So
this
he's
tree and
completely
jerk
changed
off?
his story. He's like, now he's at the scene of the crime. And not only is he at the scene of the crime, he's leaving DNA. Like,
When did he? Wait, did he tell this at the time? When did he tell the
this
jerking
is
off
in
story?
1991.
In 1991, he told the private investigator.
Private investigator. He never told the police that.
He told the police he was at Monty Python.
he was watching Monty Python at his
Right.
cousin's house. So this
Oh
is a
my God.
completely new revelation.
So he willingly was okay to the private
I
investigator.
guess. I mean, why not lie forever? My theory. Like, why?
Right.
If you're going to be evil, like, why ever give in? But maybe it was like a father scared thing, or maybe the father's like, fucking tell him what happened. You're still
Right.
innocent. I mean, who knows? So apparently, like, this private investigation cost over $750,000. Like,
Oh
it was
my
a serious, yeah.
God.
And it was possibly much higher than that, which I kind of believe because, right? I mean,
Yeah.
So at some point it came time to give the results to Skakel. The agency had to put it all into a cohesive report. And that was what they hired this young guy who was meeting Dominick Dunne to do.
Yeah.
He was in charge of kind of putting everything into a document that Rushton Skakel could read. And it was like a narrative storyline that wasn't just a bunch of investigation and interviews and da-da-da. He kind of put he was a writer.
24-year-old was in charge of this.
Right. By the way,
wait a minute. He was 24 when Dominick Dunne met him in 1996, you're saying?
oh, right. So he was even younger.
He was really young.
Yeah, he was really young. But here's the thing. Because he kind of came on after the investigation started, he never signed the confidentiality agreements
Oh, wow.
that those detectives all had signed. Okay. So the report basically said, and this is what was presented to Rushton, that Tommy had not killed Martha Moxley, that Michael, the 4th Skakel son, who had never been a suspect, had in all probability killed Martha Moxley. The report said that Tommy may have helped his brother after the fact, drag the body. Remember I told you had been dragged? That he might have helped after the fact in the murder. They also theorized that Michael and Tommy were, hated each other, like were fighting a lot and kind of whatever, I don't know how much more than normal siblings it was. Rushton was an alcoholic, and he apparently flipped the fuck out at the results of that report.
Yeah.
I mean, basically he was paying $1 million or whatever to get them innocent. He didn't want to hear
that
there's a whole other fucking thing I didn't fucking know about.
Right.
So he paid the agency and the report was supposedly never to be seen again.
Right.
The other theory was that Michael had a crush on Martha, and when he saw Tommy kissing her, I told you that they had been seen kind of kissing and fooling around. He got pissed and decided that he was going to have her or whatever. I mean,
or no one's going to have her.
Yeah, no one's going to have her. Who the fuck knows? So, and then, after the murder, after they find this, if you look back at Michael, he had been a troubled kid since his mom's death from brain cancer in 1973. Shortly after her death, he actually began abusing alcohol. As a child, he was not a good student. He flunked out of over a dozen schools. He had dyslexia. He just had
he had problems.
a ton of problems. His cousin Robert F. Kennedy Jr., after all of this, said that he was a small, sensitive child, the runt of the litter, with a harsh and occasionally violent alcoholic father who both ignored and abused him. So they're from a fucked up family, but
Right.
what, who isn't? I know some of you are. Okay. And then according to neighbors, like it was like the classic rich kid thing. Like they were given an unlimited amount of money and freedom and had zero supervision or consequences for any of
Right.
their actions. And then Michael continued to have problems throughout his life. In 1978, he was arrested for drunk driving. He was sent to Elon School in Poland, Maine, which will come up in next week's episode more. And it was there that he started receiving treatment for alcoholism. So I guess it's some kind of boarding school / rehab.
Yeah.
Is that a thing?
They have those.
For rich people. Mm-hmm. And he ran away from that twice too, and then left after 2 years. So, I mean, he just had a pretty fucked up life. According to Dunne, like the reason he thinks this guy came to him was that he got really emotionally invested in the story. And then he thought it was pretty fucked up that justice was never going to happen because rich people were going to cover this up. I told you about not signing the confidentiality agreement. So when he saw Dunne on TV, he's like, here's my opportunity to maybe make something happen in this story. When he left the meeting, he actually left Dunne with the complete Sutton report.
Oh my God.
In his fucking hands. So can you even imagine how excited Dominick Dunne
I was
is,
just
right?
thinking, I'm like, he's probably coming his pants right now.
I mean, it's pretty amazing. So obviously this kid's freaking out though. Like he doesn't want to be attached to giving Dunne this information in any way. And that was pretty much what Dunne thought he was going to do, but he could not help himself. And he told Dorothy Moxley that he had this information.
Wow.
And she, of course, told one person too. And that person told one person and da-da-da-da. That's how it goes. You got to keep your fucking lips shut.
So is Michael's name suddenly floating around the town?
So Michael's name starts floating around at this point. And then... Oh, Dunne also has like a weird connection to Rushton Skakel, the father, that I just want to mention quickly. They actually attended Canterbury, a Catholic boarding school in New Milford, Connecticut, together as boys. Rushton was like a few years ahead of him. And Dominick actually went to Robert Kennedy and Ethel Skakel's wedding in Greenwich, Connecticut, and saw Rushton there. So they have like these few weird connections too, which aren't related to anything, but just weird. Mm-hmm. So obviously once news of this report got out, everyone wanted to fucking see it.
Yeah.
So he did give a copy to the detective I mentioned earlier, Frank Garr, who was no longer at this point working for the Greenwich Police Department. He was sort of on his own, but just interested, I guess. And Dominick actually said that he gave the report to Frank Garr, and Frank Garr never said anything to him about it. So who the hell knows?
Weird.
It's weird. And then he received a phone call from Lucianne Goldberg, who you might remember as the literary agent who helped Monica Lewinsky.
Oh.
So she's basically the one who taped the phone calls about the blue dress with cum on it.
Yes.
But she was a big time literary agent, or she was the literary agent who helped Linda Tripp.
That's what I mean.
Yeah.
Linda Tripp.
Sorry, I'm confused.
Because Linda Tripp was the one who tricked
Linda
Monica.
Tripp tricked Monica, and Linda Tripp went to Lucianne Goldberg, and she kind of set the whole thing in motion.
Right.
So he gets this phone call from Lucianne Goldberg, who he actually knew because he had covered the Klaus von Bülow murder trial or attempted murder trial for Vanity Fair. And she, I think, had some connection to them. So they kind of knew each other in that weird social world of rich people. And she, at the time, had become the literary agent for Mark Fuhrman, who you might remember from the O.J. Simpson murder trial.
He was the bad asshole racist
He's the asshole
cop.
who said the N-word like 150 million times in that one tape and basically fucked everything up. And he had written a book at that point on the case called Murder in Brentwood, which is actually a pretty good book, even though he's a piece of shit. And she said that she was looking for an unsolved murder in which Fuhrman could take his detective skills out on next. And Dunne said to her, you should look into the Moxley case. I have some incredible information that I can give them.
Wow.
And that is where I'm going to end it this week, because now we're going to go on to Mark Furman's involvement in this case.
That's
and
crazy.
What happens. I know. Isn't there so many crazy connections?
There's so many Hollywood connections to this.
I know. It's like all over. Like every major trial is somewhat connected to this.
It's wild.
And it gets crazier.
I don't know anything about this case at
wow.
all. I didn't. And I mean, I knew that this was a murder, but I didn't know anything. So this is all... I'm on the edge of my seat right
Really?
now.
Oh, good.
I totally am on the... I'm like, oh,
it's so
what
good,
happened?
right? Like,
It's
there's just so
really-
much, like, crazy twists and turns. Because you kind of hear the case. You're like, oh, a girl got murdered. It's the rich kid in the house.
Right.
But there's all this cover-up and, like, these weird players who are just all coming together in this one crazy story. But, yeah, so I'm excited for next week. 'Cause it's, like, juicy.
It is juicy. So tune in next week for the conclusion and more crazy twists and turns in the Martha Moxley
And we'll
case.
actually be releasing it on the anniversary. So it's kind of creepy.
Oh, we will be.
I
That's
know.
true. October
So,
30th.
yeah, okay.
If you haven't yet, please visit our Patreon page if you would like to hear our bonus episodes. I know you mentioned at the top of the show. Just want to mention it again briefly.
All our other social pages.
All of our other social pages are at our Hollywood Crime Scene, except for our Twitter account, which is at HWood Crime Scene. But you can check us out on Instagram, where we post pictures involving the case.
Also, if you can rate and review us on iTunes, that's really helpful also.
Yeah, it helps us when you give us 5 stars.
Yeah.
You don't even have to write a review. Just
Yeah,
give
just
us 5 stars if you like the show.
Sure.
Okay.
Okay, bye.
All right,
Thank
bye.
you.